Welcome to Principles of Effective Crisis Leadership. I'm Dr. George Everly, and I'm with Dr. Carolyn Fowler today. And we are going through the 10 principles of effective crisis leadership. We're at number 2. Listen before you speak. Listen with the intent to understand, not simply reply. So many times we get a few words in our ears, we formulate a response, and we miss something important. At least that's the theory. Is that true, Carolyn?
Oh, yes, George. It is indeed. And I think perhaps I could just start by sharing that I really believe that listening is a gift that leaders give. People have a profound need to be heard and to be acknowledged. And so really listening is important. And in fact, a little thing that I like to share is that silent and listen are spelt with the same 6 letters. And so one of the things that we see when good listening is happening is that the leader holds some space for silence. And this is important because the first thing that somebody says to us is seldom the most important thing that they need to say. You know, they may just come in and blurt out what it is they want to say. Sometimes they're just struggling to find the words. And when we are able to hold silence long enough for them to sort of tell us what they need to tell us, then we can truly hear what it is that they're saying to us.
You said something I've never heard before, which is usually I hear listening is a gift that effective leaders have. You said something very different. Listening is a gift that effective leaders give to others. That's a really important point, I think, to have people understand. But it's not as easy, I think, as it looks. Abraham Lincoln once famously said the most important part of his day was the day he spent listening to his constituents. But even listening to people talk, it is, at least can be sometimes challenging, because people often lead with the things they're most upset with. They often lead with emotion. In fact, it was Aristotle that said, every message has an emotional component and a logical component. The problem is the emotion precedes the logic. Is that true?
That is absolutely true, George. Not only does it precede it, but people can't get to the logic and they can't get to the real processing and thinking until they've got rid of the emotion. And I think we know this conceptually, it's just hard to live it. So an analogy that I've used often with our nursing leaders is that of a pressure cooker that's blowing off steam or a car radiator that's blowing off steam. Now, we all have the good sense not to take the lid off anything that's blowing steam until we've allowed the steam to come down, the pressure to come down. But in the presence of somebody who's venting, that's steam, and we're saying, oh, let me take the lid off and see what's going on here. Let me try and solve it. And our job as leaders in that moment is to really take the pressure down. What can we do to let them just vent off some of that anger or frustration or stress? And so a question that I often use is, well, what else is bothering you? So instead of when they tell me what's bothering, trying to find a solution, I'll be like, well, and what else? And what else? It's not that I'm asking leaders to engage with the negativity or the stories that are coming out in the first venting. It's simply just to hold the space for people to take the pressure down. And then when the pressure is down, then we can get a better sense of what actually the issue is. And then we can sit with them and hear what it is they're wanting to say.
I like the approach you're taking, is that we don't have to necessarily respond to the emotions. We simply have to let them be ventilated. And I think that's another mistake that oftentimes leaders make, is they respond to the emotion, not understanding that there's really often a valid message underneath, but we get defensive and we never hear that message. Psychophysiologists have told us since the 1960s, believe it or not, that if you allow people that cathartic ventilation, they are then more calm and more able to respond in a what we would say is a more rational dialogue. And I think that's really important.
George, I think another thing that I didn't mention, and it's just a human challenge for anybody, is that in the presence of this venting, it's so easy for us as listeners to take on the emotion, take on the anxiety, take on the stress, take on the negativity, and that then stops us from listening. And so the ability of a leader to firstly notice that he or she is taking on the emotion and ground themselves, whatever your anchor behavior is, whether it's breathing, whether it's just focusing on your intention for this conversation, whatever it is, notice that and ground yourself and anchor in your commitment to hold the space for this person to talk. And if you feel like I do on occasion that I just have to give my good advice, then I use this acronym, which is WAIT. Why am I talking?
I'm afraid in my career I would come up with not so many really rational reasons why I'm talking. Sometimes leaders feel that silence is a prerogative, if not an obligation, to fill that space with verbiage. And that's not always the case. Sometimes healing can occur in silence, can it?
It can, and I think the other thing to pay attention to in the silence is how much our own stories are influencing our listening. Because when somebody is saying something to me, I want to be able to reflect back to them. And this is something you've taught me through your work in psychological first aid. That as if we do reflective listening, where we give back some of the language to the person we're listening to, they know we've heard them. And if they use words that are ambiguous, instead of us assuming we know what they're trying to say to us, we'll say, well, what do you mean by that? What does that mean to you? But so often, and I think it's a human thing, George, when somebody's telling us something, you're like, oh, me too. Yeah, I have that experience. I know what they're talking about. But this listening is not about us. It's about holding the space to listen to them and honor their experience in this time of crisis.
Good advice, Carolyn. So if we want to learn more, where do we go?
Well, let me share the slide again so that you can see the Office of Wellbeing website. It is, of course, the host for all of these things. All of the resources are being coordinated by the Office of Wellbeing. The website is there for you. We also have an email address, and we encourage you to reach out to us with suggestions, questions, comments. We're in this together. We're learning this together, and we invite you to step into this community with us.
Dr. Carolyn Fowler, thank you for sharing your insights.
Thank you, George, for being here today. And thank you, everybody, for taking the time to spend some time with us.